Lieutenant Henry Parker stood quietly at his station aboard the starship Meridian, his eyes fixed on the glowing display screen. The gentle hum of the ship's engines filled the bridge as they patrolled the outer edges of the Helios system. It was supposed to be another routine patrol, monitoring the border of human space for any unusual activity. The first sign that something was different came when the sensors picked up an odd energy signature. "Sir," Henry called out to Captain Michelle Ross, "I'm detecting some unusual readings from Sector 7. He adjusted the scanning frequency, trying to get a clearer picture of what they were seeing. Captain Ross moved from her command chair to stand behind him, her experienced eyes studying the readouts. "What kind of readings, Lieutenant?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. Before Henry could answer, the ship's communications array suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree. Linda Davis, the communications officer, nearly jumped in her seat as her console erupted with activity. "Captain, we're receiving multiple signals. They're nothing like our standard frequencies." Her fingers flew across the interface as she tried to make sense of the incoming data. The patterns, they're structured, definitely artificial. The bridge crew held their breath. After centuries of space exploration, humanity had yet to make contact with another intelligent species. Could this be the moment they had all been waiting for? Captain Ross straightened her uniform. "Put it through the translation matrix. Let's see what we're dealing with." The ship's advanced AI began processing the alien signals, converting them into something their systems could understand. As the translation progressed, Dr. Alice Ward, the ship's xenolinguist, joined them at the communication station. Her expertise would be crucial if these were indeed first contact signals. The minutes ticked by slowly as the computer worked its magic. Finally, the first translated messages began appearing on their screens. Linda's eyes widened as she read the initial text. "Captain, these are warnings. Military warnings." She looked up, her face pale. "They're from a species calling themselves the Zrylax." The messages painted a picture that none of them had expected. The Zrylax were a highly advanced civilization that had evolved in a way completely different from humans. Their entire society was built around the concept of movement as warfare. To them, any form of rhythmic motion was considered a military display. "Play the visual data," Captain Ross ordered. The main screen filled with images of the Zrylax. Tall, graceful beings with iridescent skin that seemed to shimmer with every motion. Their movements were precise, calculated, and eerily beautiful. Dr. Ward leaned forward, fascinated. "Look at their body language. Every gesture is like a military stance to them. Even their casual movements appear to be part of some complex combat system." She pointed to a sequence showing Zrylax ships moving in formation. Their space combat tactics are based on the same principle. They turn space warfare into a deadly dance. The implications hit them all at once. Humans, with their natural tendency to move rhythmically, to tap their feet to music, to dance for joy, would appear to the Zrylax as a species of supreme warriors, constantly displaying their combat readiness. "This could be very bad," Henry muttered, unconsciously stopping his habit of tapping his fingers on the console. "Every human habit, every natural movement we make. They'll see it as a challenge." Captain Ross activated the ship-wide communication system. "All personnel, effective immediately, be aware that we are implementing first contact protocols." Additionally, she paused, knowing how strange her next order would sound. "All crew members are to minimize any rhythmic movement. No tapping, no dancing, no casual swaying. Consider every movement you make as potentially significant." The Meridian's crew began spreading the word throughout the ship. In the mess hall, someone turned off the background music. In the exercise room, dance fitness classes were immediately canceled. Every human aboard started moving with careful, deliberate motions, trying to avoid anything that could be interpreted as a combat display. Meanwhile, more messages from the Zrylax continued to pour in. They spoke of their expanding territory, their interpretation of movement-based warfare, and their concern about the warrior species they had detected in this sector of space, humanity. "Send a priority message to Earth Command," Captain Ross ordered. "They need to know what we're dealing with. And notify all human ships in the sector. No aggressive movements. No standard formation flying. Everything we do from this point forward needs to take into account how the Zrylax will interpret it." As the message was being prepared, the ship's sensors detected something new. "Captain," Henry called out, his voice tense. "Multiple ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel. Zrylax design, based on the images we received." The alien vessels appeared on their screens, sleek, powerful ships that moved with an unsettling grace through space. Their formation was like nothing the human crew had ever seen before, more like a choreographed performance than a military arrangement. "They're here to assess us," Dr. Ward realized. "Everything we do next will set the tone for humanity's relationship with their species." She watched as the Zrylax ships continued their complex maneuvers. To them, this is probably a standard greeting formation. To us, it looks like they're preparing for battle. Captain Ross took a deep breath. "Send no response yet. We need to be very careful about our first move." She turned to her crew. "From this moment on, we're not just space explorers. We're diplomats performing on the most important stage of our lives. The future of human-Zrylax relations may depend on how well we can control our natural instincts to move rhythmically." As the Meridian's crew watched the alien ships dance through space, they all understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something unprecedented. Humanity's first contact with an alien species would not be defined by language, technology, or traditional displays of power, but by the way they moved, or managed not to move. The Zrylax ships continued their elegant maneuvers, waiting for Earth's response. In the tense silence of the Meridian's bridge, Captain Ross and her crew faced the challenge of their lives: how to communicate with a species that saw every human gesture as a potential act of war, and how to prevent a misunderstanding that could lead to an interstellar conflict. The clock was ticking, and somewhere on the Meridian, someone was unconsciously tapping their foot. A simple human habit that could now be interpreted as a declaration of war. Commander Richard White stood in the pristine conference room of Lunar Base Hope, trying his best to remain perfectly still. The diplomatic meeting with the Zrylax was about to begin, and every human present had been thoroughly briefed on the importance of controlling their movements. The stark white walls and polished floor reflected the artificial lighting, creating an almost sterile atmosphere. Amy Bennett, the navigation specialist chosen for the diplomatic team, found herself constantly fighting her natural tendency to sway while standing. Years of working in zero gravity had made subtle movements second nature to her. Now, those same instincts could accidentally trigger an interstellar incident. The Zrylax delegation arrived with what humans could only interpret as a ceremonial entrance. Their tall, iridescent forms moved in perfect synchronization, each step and gesture precisely calculated. To human eyes, it looked like a beautiful dance. To the Zrylax, it was their most formal military greeting. "Welcome to Lunar Base Hope," Richard said carefully, making sure to keep his gestures minimal and deliberate. The universal translators converted his words into the musical language of the Zrylax. The alien delegates responded with a series of graceful movements that their translators converted to speech. The lead Zrylax representative, whom they called First Dancer Kylexi, stepped forward. Their skin shimmered with patterns of light that seemed to pulse with each movement. "We observe your battle readiness," the translator conveyed. "Your species maintains impressive control over your war dance muscles." Richard fought back a smile, knowing that even that small expression might be misinterpreted. "We are honored by your presence," he responded, keeping his arms firmly at his sides. "We hope to establish peaceful relations between our peoples." The meeting proceeded cautiously. The human delegation had arranged chairs for everyone, not realizing that the Zrylax preferred to remain in constant, subtle motion. To them, sitting still was as foreign as dancing would be to a stone. Amy found herself fascinated by the way the Zrylax moved. Even their breathing seemed to follow a complex rhythm. As she watched, she began to understand why they interpreted human movements as they did. Every casual human gesture, the swing of arms while walking, the subtle bobbing of heads to unheard music, even the way humans shifted their weight while standing, all of it looked like combat stances to the Zrylax. The trouble began during the cultural exchange portion of the meeting. A Zrylax junior diplomat noticed Amy's unconscious swaying and immediately dropped into what they called a defense dance position. The other Zrylax instantly responded, their movements becoming more elaborate and intense. "Please," Richard said quickly, raising his hands in what humans considered a peaceful gesture, but which the Zrylax interpreted as a challenge to elevated combat. "We mean no aggression. Our movements are not meant as warfare displays." First dancer Kyloxi's skin flickered with patterns that the human observers could only guess were signs of agitation or concern. "Your warrior displays are most refined," the translator conveyed. "Such casual mastery of supreme combat movements must indicate a species of unprecedented military prowess." The situation grew more tense as other members of the human delegation struggled to maintain completely still postures. Dr. Stephen Cole, the team's xenobiologist, accidentally tapped his fingers on the conference table, a nervous habit that sent ripples of movement through the Zrylax delegation. The aliens' responses became increasingly elaborate. Their movements, while beautiful, carried an unmistakable edge of what humans recognize as military precision. The translation system struggled to keep up with the complex combinations of gesture, light, and sound that made up the Zrylax language. "Perhaps," Amy suggested carefully, "we could demonstrate how our movements are often expressions of joy or relaxation, not combat." As soon as she spoke, she realized her mistake. The slight head tilt she naturally made while speaking sent another wave of reaction through the Zrylax delegation. First dancer Kyloxi's skin now pulsed with rapid patterns. "Your ability to incorporate war dance movements into casual speech is remarkable. Truly, we face a civilization of supreme combat masters." Richard tried to salvage the situation. "We wish to learn about your culture," he said, consciously keeping his body as still as possible. "Perhaps you could teach us the meaning of your movements, and we could explain ours." The Zrylax delegates conferred among themselves in a series of intricate gestures that the translators couldn't fully interpret. Finally, first dancer Kyloxi turned back to the humans. "We must report to our High Dance Council. Your species' war dance mastery exceeds anything in our records. We must prepare appropriate responses." Before the humans could protest further, the Zrylax performed what appeared to be an elaborate farewell ceremony, though the humans would later learn it was actually a formal combat readiness display, and departed the conference room. As the doors closed behind the alien delegation, the human diplomatic team finally allowed themselves to relax their rigid postures. Amy slumped into a chair, while Richard ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Well," Dr. Cole said, breaking the tense silence, "that could have gone better." He looked down at his hands, still fighting the urge to tap them against the table. "They think we're some kind of super warriors, don't they?" Richard nodded grimly. "Every natural human movement looks like a combat display to them. Even our attempts to be still probably came across as some kind of advanced battle meditation." He turned to Amy, who was now freely swaying in her chair. "We need to find a way to communicate that not everything we do is about warfare. But how do we explain dance and rhythm to a species that sees all rhythmic movement as combat?" Amy wondered aloud. "It's like trying to explain colors to someone who sees everything in shades of battle." The diplomatic team spent the next few hours reviewing recordings of the meeting, trying to understand where they might have gone wrong and how they could better approach future interactions. But with each replay, it became clearer that the cultural gap might be wider than they had initially thought. As they left the conference room, a message arrived from Earth Command. Zrylax ships were taking up defensive positions throughout their sector of space. The aliens had interpreted humanity's very existence as a potential threat, all because of the way humans naturally moved. Richard looked out the base's window at the Earth hanging in the black sky, wondering how they could prevent a war that might start simply because humans couldn't help but dance. In the following days, as the diplomatic team prepared their reports and recommendations, they couldn't help but appreciate the irony. Humanity's first major interstellar crisis wasn't caused by aggression or resources or territory. It was caused by the simple fact that humans like to move to rhythms they felt in their hearts. As the tension between humans and the Zrylax grew, Lieutenant Timothy Green sat in the science lab of the Starship Meridian, reviewing endless streams of data from their encounters. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of computers and the occasional beep of analysis programs running their courses. His breakthrough came at 3 a.m. Earth Standard Time. During his third cup of coffee, Captain Samantha Lee, he called through the ship's communication system. "You need to see this immediately." He couldn't keep the excitement from his voice as he replayed the sensor recordings. Samantha arrived at the lab minutes later, her uniform slightly wrinkled from being on standby rest. "What have you found, Lieutenant?" she asked, leaning over his shoulder to look at the screens. Timothy pointed to a series of wave patterns. "Look at how the Zrylax ships react when our vessels move in formation. Their defensive patterns change based on our flight paths." He pulled up several recordings side by side. When our ships move in standard patrol patterns, they interpret it as aggressive. But when our ships move in certain synchronized ways, their entire fleet responds differently. The captain studied the data carefully. On the screen, a replay showed 3 Earth ships performing a standard defensive maneuver. The Zrylax vessels had responded with what they now knew were high-alert combat stances. But when the Earth ships had accidentally fallen into a smooth-flowing pattern while avoiding an asteroid field, the alien ships had shown signs of what appeared to be respect rather than fear. "Are you suggesting we could use this?" Samantha asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Could we turn their interpretation of movement to our advantage?" Timothy nodded eagerly. "Better than that. I think we might be able to communicate with them through movement itself. Look at this." He pulled up another recording, this time showing a single Earth ship that had been caught in a gravitational eddy. As the ship had spiraled gracefully through space, the nearby Zrylax vessel had responded with what their analysts now believed was a gesture of appreciation. "Get me Admiral Peter Howard," Samantha ordered. Within minutes, they had established a secure connection to Earth Command. The Admiral's face appeared on the main screen, looking tired but alert. As Timothy explained his findings, the Admiral's expression changed from skepticism to interest. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that we might be able to prevent a war by making our ships dance." "Not exactly dance, sir," Timothy corrected. "But if we can coordinate our fleet movements in ways that the Zrylax interpret as respectful rather than aggressive, we might be able to open a new channel of communication." The Admiral was quiet for a long moment. "Captain Lee," he said finally, "I'm giving you authorization to test this theory. But be careful. One wrong move could start a war we can't win." Over the next few days, the Meridian's crew worked tirelessly to develop what they called the Symphony Protocol. Using Timothy's data, they mapped out sequences of ship movements that they hoped would convey peaceful intentions to the Zrylax. In the ship's holographic training room, Carol Martinez, their best pilot, practiced the new maneuvers repeatedly. "It's like learning to speak with the ship's body," she explained to her fellow pilots. "Every turn, every acceleration, every orbit has to flow into the next like water." The first test came sooner than they expected. 3 Zrylax warships appeared near Jupiter's orbit, their movements clearly showing what humans now recognized as combat readiness. The Meridian was the closest Earth ship. "Begin Symphony Protocol," Samantha ordered, her voice steady despite the tension on the bridge. "Lieutenant Martinez, take us in. Remember, this isn't just flying, it's conversation." Carol's hands moved smoothly over the controls as she guided the Meridian into the first sequence. The ship began to move in gentle curves, its path describing what they hoped the Zrylax would interpret as a greeting rather than a challenge. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then, Amazingly, one of the Zrylax ships began to mirror their movements. Its path through space matched the Meridian's gentle curves, creating what looked like a cosmic dance between the two vessels. "They're responding," Timothy whispered, his eyes fixed on the sensor readings. "Their energy signatures are shifting to patterns we've never seen before." The dance between the ships continued, growing more complex as Carol carefully introduced new elements to their movement. The other two Zrylax ships joined in, and soon all four vessels were moving in an intricate pattern through space. "Incoming transmission," the communications officer announced. When they opened the channel, instead of the usual translator text, they received what appeared to be a series of movement coordinates. Timothy's eyes widened as he analyzed them. "They're teaching us their movements," he realized. "They're showing us how to speak their language of motion." For the next several hours, the ships continued their space ballet, each movement carrying meaning, each pattern conveying ideas that words couldn't express. Through this strange dance, the first real understanding between humans and Zrylax began to form. When they finally broke off contact, Admiral Howard's face appeared on their screen again. "Well done, Meridian," he said, looking both relieved and amazed. "You've just opened a whole new chapter in interspecies communication." But Timothy wasn't entirely satisfied. As he reviewed the recordings of their encounter, he noticed something that both excited and worried him. "Captain," he said, "I think this is just the beginning. The movements they showed us, they're like letters in an alphabet. There's a whole language here we need to learn." Samantha nodded, understanding the implications. "And if we get it wrong?" "If we get it wrong," Timothy finished, "we could accidentally declare war instead of asking for peace." As the Meridian's crew began the task of documenting and analyzing every movement and counter-movement from their encounter, they knew they were racing against time. Somewhere out there, the Zrylax High Dance Council was undoubtedly doing the same thing, trying to understand the meaning behind humanity's every motion through space. The dance had begun, and the steps they chose next would determine the fate of both species. Admiral Peter Howard stood in the main control room of Earth's Orbital Command Center, watching as hundreds of holographic ships moved in carefully planned patterns. The massive space over Earth had become a practice arena for what would become humanity's greatest coordinated space maneuver. "Status report," he called out to Lieutenant Carol Martinez, who had been promoted to lead the new Space Movement Division after her breakthrough with the Zrylax. She looked up from her control station, where she was directing a group of ships through their movements. "The Northern Fleet has mastered Pattern 7, she reported. "But we're still having trouble with the synchronized turns in Pattern 9. It's like teaching 1,000 dancers to move as one, except they're all piloting massive ships." The Zrylax had been watching Earth's practice sessions with great interest. Their ships maintained a respectful distance, but their presence was constant. According to the movement analysts, their observation patterns indicated a mix of curiosity and what they hoped was approval. "Show me the problem area again," Peter requested. The holographic display zoomed in on a section of ships attempting a complex spiral maneuver. Even to his untrained eye, he could see that some ships were slightly out of sync, creating what the Zrylax would likely interpret as disharmony in the battle dance. The stakes were incredibly high. In the 3 weeks since they had discovered how to speak to the Zrylax through coordinated movement, Earth's entire space fleet had been transformed into what was essentially a massive dance troupe. Every pilot had to learn not just how to fly their ship, but how to make it part of a greater pattern. "Admiral," a communications officer called out, "we're receiving new movement patterns from the Zrylax observation fleet." The main screen filled with data showing complex flight paths and formation changes. Carol studied the patterns intently. "They're teaching us something new," she said, her excitement evident. "These movements, they're more complex than anything they've shown us before. I think this might be their equivalent of formal diplomatic language." Peter watched as the computer generated simulations of the new patterns. "How long until we can attempt these movements?" he asked. "With the current fleet, at least a week of practice," Carol replied. These patterns require perfect timing and coordination. One ship out of place could change the entire meaning of what we're trying to communicate. The Admiral nodded. Earth's leaders had given them 1 month to prove that this new form of communication could prevent war. They were halfway through that time, and while progress had been made, they needed a breakthrough. In another part of the command center, Dr. Ben Harris, their lead movement analyst, was working with a team to decode the meaning behind each Zrylax pattern. "It's like they're showing us their formal court dances," he explained when Peter stopped by his station. "Each sequence carries specific cultural and diplomatic weight. Can we respond to them?" Peter asked. "Show them we understand." Ben pulled up a series of human design patterns on his screen. "We've created these sequences based on what we've learned. They combine elements of their movements with patterns that come naturally to human pilots. If we can perform them correctly, it might show the Zrylax that we respect their culture while maintaining our own identity." The next few days were filled with intense practice. Ships maneuvered in increasingly complex patterns, their movements growing more refined with each attempt. The Zrylax observers began showing what the analysts interpreted as signs of approval, their own ships moving in complementary patterns that suggested harmony rather than confrontation. Then came the day of their first full fleet demonstration. Over 1,000 Earth ships gathered in the space between Earth and Mars, preparing to perform the most complex series of coordinated movements in human history. Carol sat at her central control station, her hands steady on the controls despite the pressure. "All ships report ready, Admiral," she announced. "Permission to begin the symphony." Peter took a deep breath. Everything they had worked for came down to this moment. "Begin the sequence, Lieutenant. Let's show them who we are." The Earth fleet began to move. Ships flowed through space in perfect harmony, their patterns telling a story of humanity's journey to the stars. The movements spoke of peace and exploration, of respect for the Zrylax culture while maintaining human identity. At first, the Zrylax ships merely observed. Then, gradually, they began to move in response. Their fleet merged into the dance, creating patterns that interwove with the human movements. The space between Earth and Mars became a vast ballet of starships, each movement carrying meaning, each pattern telling a story. "They're accepting our patterns," Ben announced excitedly. "The way they're moving. According to our analysis, these are gestures of highest respect." The dance continued for hours, growing more complex and beautiful as both species learned to move together. When it finally ended, the Zrylax fleet arranged themselves in what they now knew was a formation of peaceful cooperation. A message came through their translators. "Your species dances with both power and grace. We see now that your movements are not merely those of war, but of life itself." The High Dance Council wishes to establish permanent diplomatic relations. The control room erupted in cheers, but Carol noticed something interesting on her screens. "Admiral," she called out, "look at this. The patterns they're using now, they're different from anything we've seen before. It's like they're creating a new language, one that combines their traditional movements with elements of human spaceflight." Peter smiled. "Then we'll learn it together," he said. "Sometimes the best conversations happen without words." As the Earth fleet returned to their stations, the Zrylax remained in their formation of peace. Humanity had not only avoided a war, but had discovered a new way of connecting with other species. Through the dance of ships in space, they had found a language that transcended words and crossed the boundaries between worlds. Mary Thompson stood before the assembled leaders of Earth's Space Command, her presentation displaying the complex patterns they had learned from the Zrylax over the past 2 months. As the head cultural specialist for human-Zrylax relations, she had made a fascinating discovery. "The Zrylax don't just see our movements as warfare," she explained, pointing to the latest data. "They see them as a complete language. Every gesture, every motion tells a story. What we originally thought was just their way of showing aggression is actually their entire cultural foundation." Fleet Commander Kevin Phillips listened intently. His fleet had been practicing the new movement patterns for weeks, preparing for what they hoped would be a historic demonstration of unity between the two species. "We've learned enough of their movement language now to propose something unprecedented," Marie continued. "A joint performance, something that will show both our understanding of their culture and our own unique way of moving through space." The plan was ambitious. The largest coordinated fleet movement ever attempted, combining both human and Srilax ships in a display that would be visible from Earth's surface. They called it Operation Starlight Symphony. Over the next few days, final preparations were made. Ships from both species gathered in high Earth orbit, their crews making last-minute adjustments to their formation positions. The Srilax High Dance Council had sent their most prestigious movement specialists to participate. "All ships report ready," announced Captain Susan Ward from her control station. The combined fleet of over 2,000 vessels, both human and Srilax, waited in their starting positions. Kevin took a deep breath before giving the command. "Begin the harmony sequence." The performance started slowly. Human ships moved in patterns that they had carefully designed to show respect for Srilax traditions while maintaining their own style. The Srilax vessels responded with movements that mirrored and complemented the human formations. As the dance progressed, something unexpected began to happen. The Srilax ships started incorporating elements of human movement patterns, while the Earth vessels found themselves naturally flowing into Srilax formations. The two styles began to merge, creating something entirely new. "Look at that," Marie whispered, watching the display. "They're not just copying each other, they're creating a new form of movement together." From Earth's surface, the display appeared as a shifting constellation of lights, drawing patterns across the night sky that had never been seen before. Millions of people watched as their ships danced with alien vessels in perfect harmony. The climax of the performance came when both fleets merged into a massive spiral formation, with ships from both species interwoven in a complex pattern that spoke of unity and mutual understanding. The movement analysts later said that this particular formation would become known as the pattern of peace in both human and Srilax records. As the final sequences concluded, a message came through from the Srilax High Dance Council. "In all our history of movement, we have never seen such perfect harmony between two species. Today, we do not see human ships and Srilax ships. We see dancers in the greatest performance our civilization has ever witnessed." The success of Operation Starlight Symphony led to the establishment of the first joint movement academy on Mars, where humans and Srilax could learn each other's ways of moving through space. The academy's first class included pilots from both species, learning to understand each other through the language of motion. 1 month after the performance, Marie visited the academy. She found human pilots learning the intricate patterns of Srilax formal movement, while Srilax students studied videos of human dance and space maneuvers. The two species had found common ground in the most unexpected way. "We were so worried about their interpretation of our movements as warfare," she said to Kevin during the tour. "We never imagined that this misunderstanding would lead to the most beautiful form of communication we've ever developed." The impact of this cultural exchange spread beyond just space movement. Earth architects began incorporating Srilax movement principles into their designs. Srilax artists became fascinated with human dance forms. A new art form emerged, one that combined the precision of Srilax movement with the spontaneity of human expression. In the years that followed, other alien species would encounter this unique blend of human and Srilax culture. They would find two species that had turned a potential cause for war into a celebration of their differences and similarities. The story of the human war dance became legend among the stars, not as a tale of conflict, but as an example of how misunderstanding could lead to discovery, and how two very different species could learn to move together in harmony. As Marie watched a class of mixed human and Srilax students practicing their movements, she smiled at how far they had come. What had started as a diplomatic crisis had transformed into something beautiful, a dance that would continue across the generations, teaching both species new ways to move through the cosmos together. The last entry in her official report read, "In learning to dance with the Srilax, we haven't just avoided a war. We've discovered a new way of being human. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries come not from our differences, but from learning to move together in spite of them. And somewhere in the space above Mars, human and Drylax ships continued their eternal dance, writing their story of peace in patterns of light across the stars.